Great. So hi, everybody. Thank you again for joining tonight's Chronic Wasting Disease informational webinar. We appreciate you taking the time to come and listen tonight. My name is Stephanie Reckmeyer, and I'm going to be assisting with the webinar. Quickly, I'm going to go over a quick overview of our panelists tonight. First, we're going to hear from Kevin Hines with DEC's Wildlife Health Unit about what CWD is. Then we'll hear about a recent incident that occurred in Herkimer, New York from Andy McDuff, our Region 6 Natural Resource Supervisor. Next, we'll hear from Jeremy Hurst, DEC's Game Management Section Leader, and he's going to go over surveillance of CWD across the state. And lastly, we will hear from DEC's Bureau Chief for the Bureau of Wildlife, Jim Farquhar, to learn more about CWD prevention. So without further ado, let me pass this off to our first presenter tonight, Kevin Hines. So Kevin, you can go ahead and unmute yourself.
Good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining us. My name is Kevin Hines. I'm with the Wildlife Health Unit of DEC. And tonight I'm going to talk to you about chronic wasting disease, what it is, and why it's bad. Next slide, please, Stephanie. So we're going to start out with a distribution map of CWD across the US and Canada. This map is current as of April 2025. CWD was first detected in mule deer at a captive wildlife research facility in Colorado in the late 1960s. They weren't quite sure what it was. They described it as a wasting syndrome, and they were seeing cases both inside the fence, and eventually, a number of years later, they started to see cases outside the fence. These dark gray squares in the Colorado region on this map indicate the distribution of CWD in wild deer as of the year 2000. All of the remaining points and counties on the map have happened in the last 25 years. So the grayed out counties are, the light gray counties are areas where CWD has been detected in wild deer. The little dots represent captive cervid facilities. And captive cervid facilities can be anything from facilities that are raising deer for venison or for antler velvet or antlers. But commonly they're facilities that are breeding deer to have very large antlers, abnormally, unnaturally large antlers. And it's also facilities that are high fence hunt facilities where people will pay money to go shoot these deer with unnaturally large antlers. So that's kind of what the captive cervid industry is in a nutshell. The yellow dots represent captive cervid facilities where CWD has been detected, but those facilities have been depopulated. The red dots represent captive cervid facilities where CWD has been detected, but they have not been depopulated. And those are situations where CWD is just kind of festering, and that's not a very good idea, in my opinion. If you look at New York, you'll see there's two yellow dots. The one on the left represents a CWD detection in two captive cervid facilities in Rome, in Oneida County, New York, in 2005. Our ag and markets immediately depopulated those two facilities, and DEC went in and we aggressively sampled wild deer within a 10-mile radius of those two facilities. We killed and tested just under 300 deer, and we found two infected in the wild, an adult doe and a male fawn. We developed a containment area. No deer were allowed to leave that area. Any deer taken by a hunter needed to be tested. We did not detect any further cases in that area and dissolved the containment area after about 5 years. The yellow dot to the right represents a 2024 detection in a red deer facility, which Andy McDuff is going to tell you about immediately following this presentation. You'll notice that some states have, well, so what I'm trying to show with this map is there was a lot of movement of captive deer between facilities, both to bolster their genetics or to ship animals to high fence hunting areas. And that's why it was able to jump these across these large geographic areas so quickly. Next slide, please. So what is chronic wasting disease? It's a prion disease of cervids. also known as a transmissible spongiform encephalopathy. The most famous of these prion diseases is mad cow disease, which was detected in cattle in Europe in the mid 1980s. There's also a prion disease of sheep called scrapie, which we've known about for quite some time, and some people think may have been the progenitor of mad cow disease. And some people also think may be the progenitor of chronic wasting disease. There's also some prion diseases of humans, the most common being Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, which has a genetic component, but also can happen sporadically in older individuals. So prions aren't viruses or bacteria or fungi. They are simply misfolded proteins. And once these proteins misfold and become disease prions, they gain the ability to induce adjacent proteins to misfold as well. And those adjacent misfolded proteins can do the same thing, and it's a cascading effect. And eventually, you get a buildup of these prion proteins in the brain and spinal cord, and you get cell death and neurologic decline. Also, once the prions become misfolded, they become very difficult to unfold. So it's very difficult to inactivate these prions. If I have a CWD suspect or a known CWD material here at the lab, we need to incinerate that carcass and then take the ash from that incinerated carcass, soak it in 2 normal sodium hydroxide overnight, and then burn it the next day again at 1800 degrees Fahrenheit for an hour to make sure that we've inactivated these prions. Based on observations with scrapie in sheep, the scrapie prion, we think that the CWD prion can remain infectious on the environment, on the landscape, for 16 years or more, which is a long time. Next slide, please. So when I say it's a prion disease of cervids are deer, elk, moose, and reindeer. In New York, our native cervids are white-tailed deer and moose, but a number of different species of cervids are kept in captivity. The photograph up in the upper left is a photomicrograph of CWD infected brain material. And you'll notice those white areas, which are areas where the cells have died. Early on with these type of diseases, pathologists thought that these slides reminded them of sponges, hence the name spongiform encephalopathy. So a deer gets infected, and this disease has a very long incubation period, 1 to 2 years. So the deer becomes exposed to an infectious prion. It's infected. After about a month, the deer starts to shed infective prions in its saliva, its feces, and its urine. And every day, potentially during the course of a year to 2 years, it's peeing and pooping and drooling out disease prions on the landscape, which are going to remain infective up to 16 years potentially. After about a year and a half to 2 years, depending on the deer, you start to see a decline in body condition, and then they could become visibly sick. The photograph of the deer on the left is kind of a classic end-stage CWD photo. You've got a deer in very poor body condition, kind of emaciated. Its heads are typically lowered, the ears are drooping, and it's just drooling out copious amounts of saliva with prions, and it dies. In many cases, deer never make it to this stage. They die well before this, during the late incubation stage, where they aren't making very good decisions. They're more susceptible to being hit by a motor vehicle, killed by a predator, or killed by a hunter. And by nature of their behavior, male deer are more likely to be infected than females. Next slide, please. In a deer carcass, these CWD prions are concentrated in the brain, the spinal cord, the eyes, the lymph nodes, the spleen, and in the gastrointestinal tract. If I went down to my buddy's place in Pennsylvania and I shot an infected doe and I gutted it down there and I brought it up to my house in Troy and I butchered it in my garage and packaged up all the venison, put it in the freezer, I'd have left the head and the spine and some other bones and scraps, which would contain lymph nodes. And the best case scenario is for me to take that material, double bag it, put it in the household trash, so it ends up in a lined landfill that gets covered over and deer don't have access to it. But sometimes people might take that material and put it out in the backyard and put a game camera on it and see what kind of critters come to eat it. What they're in effect doing in a situation like that is they're seeding that area with prions that deer can be exposed to, and they can start an infectious foci in their own backyard, which you definitely don't want. Next slide, please. So deer are exposed to the prions orally, and deer do a lot of things orally. They're always kind of sniffing each other, rubbing against each other, where the prions can be passed. And also this can happen at a fence line between captive deer and wild deer can nose each other through the fence and exchange these disease prions. An infected female deer might infect her fawn in utero, and the fawn will be born with CWD. If it's not born with CWD, if she's infected, the fawn will be infected at birth when she cleans it off with her tongue after birth. I talked about CWD prions being infective on the landscape for 16 years or more, but what I didn't mention is it binds to the soil, and plants can actually take those prions up into their plant tissue, so into hay and into corn, where those prions are still infective, and they could infect an animal. So in addition to this really problematic environmental contamination with a long infectious period, you've got a very long incubation period in the deer itself after it's infected. So typically, when a hunter shoots a deer that's infected, they look at it and go, well, this deer looks like it's in pretty good body condition. It probably doesn't have CWD. But that's not the case. You really have to have it tested if you're in an area where chronic wasting disease is known to persist, because they're not always skinny. In most cases, when they're taken by hunters, they're in good body condition. After the deer dies, all the prions that are in its brain and spinal cord and its entire body kind of work their way down into the soil and remain to be taken up by plant material or exposed to other deer over the next 16 years or so. Next slide, please. So how does CWD spread? Well, natural deer movements, right? Young male deer are known to travel pretty far in their first and second year of life. And so just on the hoof, the disease can spread. Movement of hunter harvested infected deer. That's the scenario I just described, where I went to my buddy's place in Pennsylvania and brought it back to Troy and set up a foci in my backyard. You definitely want to avoid that. In the feces of scavengers, any scavengers that eat on a dead deer, they're taking in those prions, raccoons, opossums, crows, and those feces or those prions are deposited in their feces the next day, maybe a mile or so distant, where it can start another infectious foci. The unnatural movement of live deer, the captive cervid industry. I talked about that earlier. There's a photograph in the lower right to show some of these large antlers that they're striving for. There is no USDA accepted live test available for CWD, so they can't really test these deer before they move them. And the incubation period is so long, they look normal, they look healthy when they ship them, but they're infected with CWD. In deer urine sold for hunting lure. So the little bottles of deer urine that you can get at Walmart and Dick's all come from captive cervid facilities. And DEC considers captive cervid facilities the very highest risk for CWD. Even USDA certified herds are coming down with CWD. You might see on some of these urine bottles that they're checked. They have a green check mark that says that it's CWD free. The laboratory that they use to test these bottles are actually financed by the urine and the captive cervid industry. So you've got kind of the industry policing itself, and they're definitely not testing each individual bottle of urine. So if you're setting up a mock scrape in your backyard or your favorite hunting area, you could potentially be seeding that with CWD prions from a captive cervid facility. Another possible route of movement is deer semen. In New York, our captive cervid facility owners are not allowed to bring in live deer from outside of New York, but they are allowed to use artificial insemination. And it has been shown that in infected deer, the CWD prions can be found in the semen. So that's another potential possibility. And in contaminated plant products. I mentioned that it can go up in the corn and hay. If you're getting corn from an area in southern Wisconsin where CWD is very prevalent and there's a lot of it on the landscape, you could be moving that prion in that corn, which could be eaten by a deer in another state potentially. Next slide, please. So should you eat CWD positive venison? The reason this is even a question is because with mad cow disease, when that was first discovered, it was initially thought that this disease would not go into people. But after about a 10-year incubation period, they did find that people were getting infected with mad cow disease prions, and it was showing up in the form of a new variant or variant Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease in humans. So that's why people are concerned that CWD, also being a prion disease, could potentially go into people. Most of the experimental data so far has shown that the species barrier is pretty strong and it probably won't go into humans. We have no convincing evidence or no evidence at all that it has gone into humans. The Center for, but most of those experiments were not done with humans. They're done with genetically modified mice and other species. So they're kind of extrapolating. The Center for Disease Control and Prevention recommends that if you're hunting in an area where CWD is known to exist, that you have your deer tested, and if it's positive, you do not eat it. Health authorities, both at the state and federal level, are looking for potential CWD cases in humans in areas where there is high prevalence of CWD, like southern Wisconsin, where a lot of people are not testing their deer, and there's a lot of folks that are eating CWD infected deer. So the answer to this question is likely going to come out of Wisconsin eventually. Our advice is do not hunt or consume any sick or strange acting deer. Next slide, please. So the takeaways: CWD, it's always fatal. There's no cure, there's no treatment, and there's no resistance. You might hear captive cervid farmers say that they're breeding in genetically CWD resistant deer, but those deer are not immune to CWD. It takes longer for them to get CWD, and when they have it, it takes them longer to die from CWD. And that's not really a good thing. The longer they live and they're infected, the more they are shedding prions into the environment and contaminating the environment. There are no immune deer currently on that we know about. CWD will have a significant impact to wild deer. Certainly with infected deer, it reduces their survival rate. It'll eventually alter the herd structure, both age-wise and sex-wise, and it'll result in population reductions over time. Once the prevalence reaches about 30%, which they're starting to see in southern Wisconsin after about 25 years of infection, where 60% of the adult bucks in some counties and 30% of the adult does are infected, they're starting to actually see population reductions in those areas. Once CWD is established in a wild herd and you've got that environmental contamination, there's really no effective control once it's established. Our management methods have focused on preventing introduction into New York and trying to keep it out, and acting quickly and aggressively if we find a case to determine the prevalence rate and reduce the population density in that area to reduce transmission. And lastly, there's no evidence that CWD infects humans, but caution is warranted. The disease may change over time, especially if the prion goes into some other species. It could gain the ability to go into humans that way, which has been shown with some other prion diseases. Thank you.
Thanks, Kevin. We're going to turn it over to Andy now. Andy McDuff, here you go. I will just pass on to you.
Thank you. Good evening, everybody. I'm Andy McDuff. I'm the Natural Resources Supervisor here in DEC Region 6. Formerly worked for the Bureau of Wildlife for over 20 years and was still acting in an acting capacity when we had our experience with CWD last fall. So that's why I'm joining you tonight. So I want to talk about our response to the CWD case that we had last October, and also plans that we have for this fall and beyond. Next slide, please. So I'll go over a sequence of events real quick to start. So just about a year ago, we were notified by Department of Ag and Markets that they had confirmed a positive case of CWD in one captive red deer from a farm in town of Columbia in Herkimer County. The timeline actually starts a little bit before that. These deer had been slaughtered by the owner as part of his process. He sold these things in a couple of markets, sold the meat, and the the owner was working with Ag and Markets through their herd monitoring program. So he was submitting samples that way. And that's how this animal was detected, through that structure that had been set up to monitor these captive facilities. So once we had that news, that meant that our interagency CWD response plan was immediately activated. That plan was developed, after our first experience with CWD back in the early 2000s, and I think is currently undergoing revision right now as well. It's kind of a living document that we update as needed. But it's a great tool because it dictates what our actions will be going forward, whether it was a detection in a captive herd or a wild herd, depends on time of year. So that kind of, lays out what our actions are going to be going forward. So the next day, the 25th, we had our first of many, many, many interagency calls to discuss a plan of action. And out of that discussion, two things were identified. Obviously, we're going to depopulate the captive herd because that's standard protocol. And we also wanted to conduct both targeted and enhanced surveillance of the wild white-tailed deer just to see if it had gotten out into the wild population. So October 29th, we conducted a site visit. Myself, Kevin, and Jim were there. One of our divisional law enforcement investigators was there, as well as a few staff from Ag and Markets. We just wanted to get our eyes on the facility, see if we could drill down on how CWD got there, take a look at the integrity of the fence, try to get a handle on the number of animals that were there, and really, in a way, prep the owner for what was about to happen, because their life was about to change pretty dramatically. We conducted our targeted surveillance during the days of November 5th to the 7th. We had actually identified a second week that we didn't need. And then the captive herd depopulation occurred roughly the 2 weeks, November 11th to 25th. Next slide, please. So I'll talk a little bit about the captive herd depopulation. If you've not seen a red deer, there's an image of a stag and a female right there. They're pretty similar to elk, a little bit more robust antler structure, I would say, but they're big animals. I mean, they're not white-tailed deer. They're quite large. So November 11th is when on-site operations at the farm were initiated. Ag and Markets doesn't have the same resources that we have, so they partnered with the USDA Wildlife Services to handle the removal of the animals. Those folks are actually quite skilled in that line of work and are able to work pretty efficiently. Active removal began on November 12th, and by November 15th, they'd removed 103 red deer from the facility, and all of those animals had samples extracted that were sent out for testing to see if they had CWD. It did take about another 10 days. They were able to remove one additional animal for a total of 194. The pasture these animals were in was about 80 acres and did have some trees and some rolling terrain. So it's understandable that one kind of evaded detection for a while, but they were actually able to finally get that last animal. So all of those were submitted for testing, and ultimately another 3 additional red deer tested positive for a total of 4. So it gave us an incidence rate within the fence of about 2%, which is, not ideal, but suggests we probably were still pretty early in the process for having CWD on that facility. Just a point of interest as far as carcass handling, they were held on site until test results were available. The positive deer were disposed of in an alkaline digester, as Kevin mentioned. Getting rid of the prions is a real challenge, but the digester is one way to do that. And then all the non-positives were just transported to a landfill and disposed of that way. Next slide, please. So the targeted surveillance of wild deer, again, we wanted to answer the question, did this disease break containment? Was it out in the wild herd? So we established a roughly half-mile buffer around the captive facility from where we wanted to collect deer immediately. So Central Office wildlife staff, in conjunction with Region 6 wildlife staff, spent a lot of time in those early days contacting landowners, obtaining permission to get on their property and collect some deer. And I have to say, just like in 2005, landowners were overwhelmingly supportive of these efforts. I think we only had 1 or 2 that denied us access, and then maybe another 1 or 2 that placed some kind of limits on us, like only take 2 deer or try not to shoot any bucks or whatever the case may be. But overwhelmingly, the public was incredibly supportive, and that was certainly our experience the first time around as well. So we also decided to work jointly with USDA Wildlife Services for the collection effort. We certainly have that capability within DEC, but it's just so much more efficient to work with them. Really good at what they do, and they're able to get us a lot of deer quickly. So we established a target sample size of 12 to 30 wild deer that we wanted to collect from within that half-mile buffer. And for the most part, we succeeded there. There were a few that might have bumped out maybe 3/4 of a mile out, just the way property ownership is and road access and stuff. But we got a pretty robust sample from pretty close to that facility. Next slide, please. So the process was the USDA staff, we would all meet late afternoon into early evening, discuss the day's plan of action, share landowner access maps, and then make our way out to the site. Initially, the USDA personnel would operate independently, so they would each go to a location they'd identified and set up to just try and catch some deer, coming out for the evening for natural movements that they could, then collect for us. After sunset, the 3 USDA personnel then joined forces and worked as one team. Once you start shooting deer after sundown, it takes a little bit more focus. So working as that team really boosts their efficiency and their safety. So the DEC staff, we serve essentially as support teams. So USDA would harvest a deer. They would put a pin on a map, and they would send that out to a text group that we had set up. And then they would mark it with these LED highway road flare pucks that you see depicted there. And then the nearest DEC team would go in to recover that animal. So when we got to a deer, we would, fill out a tag with some location information, sex of the deer, age of the deer, if we could determine it right there. And then we'd bag them up in these large, heavy-duty plastic bags that we have for this work, and then load those bagged deer into plastic concrete mixing tubs in our trucks. Once any DEC crew had, 2, 3, 4 deer in the truck, then they would head to the lab to start sample extraction. So for this event, we ended up using our CWD lab in Rome for all of the sample extraction work. That facility was built after our first experience with CWD, and it wasn't terribly far away from where we were working, so it was just really efficient to get back there. It's all set up for this kind of work, so it worked out really well. Next slide, please. So to give you an idea of what it looks like, I mean, that's what we would see when we drive up to the location. On the left there, you can see that's a small buck there with a puck that was on it. It's amazing how bright they were. Full disclosure, despite how bright they were, we did actually miss a deer for a couple of days. We had a landowner that contacted us later that week and said, "Hey, I think you missed one." And sure enough, we did. So we were able to get back out and recover that animal and get samples pulled from that to get it tested as well. Just, with a little bit of a fold in the ground or a little bit of cover, it was certainly understandable. You could miss even that bright LED light in the right conditions. So ultimately, in those 3 days, USDA was able to collect 41 deer for us, of which we tested 31. So at that point in this event, we had made the decision to not test fawns. I mean, fawns at that point in the year would be 5 or 6 months old, and the likelihood of detecting the disease in fawns is lesser than an adult deer, although it's certainly not zero. Subsequently, when we got into our monitoring phase, we did end up deciding to test fawns, and I think going forward we would probably test them all, no matter what time of year we're out. If you got them in hand, you might as well collect a sample and test them. So the picture on the right shows someone extracting a sample. We would collect a section of the brainstem called the obex, and then the retropharyngeal lymph nodes, which are tucked back into the base of the skull there, and ship those off to the lab. So the good news was, of those 31 deer that we had tested, all of them were non-detect for CWD. So at least after that initial collection, we had a little bit of a sigh of relief that it hadn't gotten into the wild herd yet, but there was more work to come. Next slide, please. So we were right on the doorstep of the regular firearms deer season for the southern zone, and we wanted to collect more samples. You can see we wanted a sample size of up to 250 deer if we could get them, at least 150 if possible. And with deer season right around the corner, it was a great opportunity to partner with hunters to really efficiently get some samples quickly. So we had to identify an area of interest. We always like to use a buffer radius around our point of interest, but that doesn't translate well to the ground. So we did establish, I believe it was a 5-mile buffer, which ended up touching 7 towns. But we dialed that back to just a 6-town area of interest. Frankfort was originally included, but we decided to drop it out just because just a tiny corner of the town was included. So you can see it was the town of German Flats, Litchfield, Winfield, Columbia, and Warren in Herkimer County, and the town of Richfield in Otsego County. We also reached out to all the municipal, county, and state highway departments to enlist their help in collecting vehicle-killed deer. It's another good source of some fairly easy to grab samples, and they were all really wonderful to work with, very accommodating, willing to do whatever we were looking for. But the main focus was hunter harvested deer, and we had a few avenues we could pursue doing that. Big one was venison processors. Obviously, they're taking in a lot of deer every year from hunters anyway, so we were able to partner with them, and we did pay them a fee, $25 per bagged head that they would collect for us, and that gave us some really good numbers. We also worked with taxidermists, recognizing that some hunters are going to shoot some deer that they would want to have mounted. They might be some kind of trophy size animal. So partnering with them, taxidermists who were able to extract the sample, we would pay them $30 to do that for us. And then ultimately, we wanted to work with hunters themselves. I mean, we recognize that lots of hunters process their own deer, aren't necessarily taking them to meat cutters or taxidermists. So we needed to figure out an avenue to work with them as well, because that was certainly going to be the bulk of the traffic potentially. Next slide, please. So as you can imagine, it'd be super inefficient if we just sat at our desks and waited for hunters to call us to come pick up their head. So we were lucky. We were able to partner with the Pennsylvania Game Commission, and they loaned us 8 of these CWD head collection bins that they had been using for their work as well. So we got those trucked up here. We ended up deploying 7 of them, scattered them throughout the towns as best we could. And basically a hunter would, harvest their deer, remove the head and a little bit of the neck, and then bring it to one of these bins and fill out a tag, put it in a bag and drop it in. And then we'd make periodic rounds and pick up the heads and get them to the lab and get the samples extracted. So really, really innovative way to engage with hunters and try to make it as easy as possible for them to provide samples, and super efficient way for us to go about it as well. Next slide. So the results of the enhanced surveillance throughout this end date of February 2025 was, we ended up collecting 201 deer heads total from the area. That included the 31 from our targeted surveillance, so 170 that were from either roadkill or hunter kill. The great news is all of those were non-detect for CWD as well. So we were able to actually run samples on 196 of them. We got a little bit of a math error there in our table. 5 of them we couldn't use for testing. Either, staff had pulled the wrong tissues, or perhaps the deer had been, had actually been shot in the head or something. So the samples were actually destroyed and we weren't able to grab them. But still, it's a pretty good track record. So that's, great news. We were right in the middle of our desired sample size, and everything came back clean. So a little bigger sigh of relief, but we still got some work to do. Next slide, please. So that's 2024. So we're on the doorstep of, actually, some hunting seasons have started in the southern zone already, and the regular season's about to come, but we've got more work to do. So we want to continue that enhanced surveillance in that 6-town area of interest. We have quite a bit larger sample size this year. We're looking for a minimum of 295 samples. We're going to repeat all the same things we did before. We'll work with taxidermists, work with venison processors. We'll have the head bins deployed. We will certainly collect roadkill if it's available. So you might be wondering how you can help, and it's actually pretty simple. So if you happen to live or hunt in that area, definitely report any sick acting deer that you see to the nearest DEC office. If we'll roll out there, we'll assess the situation. If necessary, we'll collect that animal and add it to the sample stream just to see what's going on. But beyond that, if you're a hunter, submitting the head of any deer you harvest from that area would be super helpful. We know from our harvest estimates and projections that enough deer are being taken in those 6 towns that we should be able to achieve this sample size. So we just need hunter cooperation. We're going to have all 8 head bins deployed this year. I think I've got a map here coming up where you can get a quick peek of where they are. And it's really pretty simple to do and should be minimal burden on the hunter. So we certainly encourage you to do that. And ultimately, if we can meet these sample sizes through hunter harvested deer and roadkill deer, that reduces the likelihood that we would have to go out and do any active collections ourselves, and definitely boosts our confidence that we're still CWD free. So we'd appreciate the help. Next slide, please. So there's a map of the locations. We're going to have a couple, 3 it looks like in Ilion. One's going to be in Jordanville. I think we got a couple in Mohawk, one in West Winfield, and then one at Richfield Springs, which also happens to be the property of a venison processor. So I guess you got a couple of options for providing a sample at that location. Next slide. And then the process, what you need to do to provide a sample for. So it's really simple. When you do remove the deer's head, make sure you leave a little bit of the neck remaining. And the reason for that is particularly on a warm deer, if you cut too close to the skull, you could actually leave the lymph nodes that we're looking for on the carcass rather than with the head. So leave 2-3 inches of the neck there and we'll be in good shape. Keep the head either frozen or chilled until you're going to take it to the drop box. If it is a buck and you want the antlers, by all means, remove the skull plate and the antlers before you submit it to us. And again, if it's a buck you want to have mounted, work with a taxidermist. They could probably pull the sample for you, so then you wouldn't even need to take the head to the bin. They could do everything right there for you. But if you are going to go to the bin, put the head in a plastic bag, garbage bag, something similar will work just fine. At the drop box, we'll have CWD head tags there that you'll need to fill out with some basic contact information, some harvest location information, pretty rudimentary stuff, pretty simple. Put that tag in the small bag that we provide, and then put both that and the head in your larger bag and seal it up somehow. Use a zip tie, tie a knot in it, whatever works for you. Drop it in the bin, and you're good to go. And that will be tremendously helpful to us. So next slide. So hopefully we'll pop this up at the end, but if you want to read more about a lot of what I just covered, you can go to that first link, which is our main landing page for chronic wasting disease. And on that page, you'll find links for a summary report of our activities last fall, as well as plans for what we're going to do for 2025 and beyond. And you can also see the interagency CWD response plan. And I believe that is the end for me.
Thanks, Andy, and thanks everybody else for joining us for this CWD webinar. My name is Jeremy Hurst. I work in our central office in the Bureau of Wildlife, specifically within the game management section, and I've spent much of my career working with the big game program and have been involved in some CWD work all the way along. And so I want to talk tonight about CWD surveillance. And so I appreciate the introduction that Kevin gave over what CWD is and why it's bad. And then Andy following up with the work that we're doing to respond for these hotspot situations that have risen in the last 20 years. But really the question comes for CWD surveillance as to why it's important. And you'll see my subhead there that we want to find CWD before it gets established. If it's present in the state, it's very important for us to find it quickly. As Andy just walked through, a response involves quite a lot of work for the agency. And as Kevin indicated, CWD presence creates quite a lot of challenge for deer and the public who love deer. And so Obviously, the best scenario is to keep CWD out of New York, but if it gets here, we want to find it fast. Research from states and provinces that have CWD have suggest that a prevalence rate of about 1.5% or 15 deer out of every 1,000. If the prevalence gets that high, then managing the spread of the disease becomes exceptionally difficult. The sooner we find it, the faster we can respond, and the more likely we are to have success. So next slide, please. So in New York, we use a risk-weighted approach for determining our surveillance for CWD. I'll get to really what that means in a minute, but we work closely in conjunction with the Animal Health Diagnostic Center at Cornell University to both design this surveillance approach, but also to process the CWD samples. And so Andy walked you through a little bit of the lymph nodes and the OBEX that we collect and the process of collecting these heads from taxidermists and processors, transferring to a lab where our staff or professionals at the Wildlife Pathology Unit or the Cornell Animal Health Diagnostic Center pull these samples for us. What wasn't mentioned, I don't think, is that in order to test a deer for CWD, it needs to be dead. There's no effective live test for chronic wasting disease. And so that's why we're constantly working with these hunter-killed deer or road-killed deer, because that's the only way to get an effective test of the deer. Next slide, please. And so let's start with the chart on the right. This goes back to 2002 when New York really first began looking into the presence for CWD in the state. You see that sharp increase there in 2005, and that was the initial detection of CWD on a captive facility in central New York that Kevin mentioned. And so at that time, we tested a bunch of deer that we killed ourselves, but then importantly, we set up what was considered a containment area around those initial detection areas. And in that containment area, we required all hunters to submit samples from any deer that they harvested. We also continued with roadkill collections and so on. And so because we were requiring sample collection from all hunters, the numbers of animals that we tested those first few years with following that initial detection were quite high. And then we scaled back after a few years. And ever since then, we've been using this risk-weighted system. And I'll walk through that in a moment, but it's allowed us to be much more efficient with our sampling to test in the areas or sample deer from the areas where we expect the highest risk to be present. And we're able to test between 2,000 and 3,000 deer a year and achieve quite strong confidence that when we have no detections, that represents no disease present in the state. And so the map on the left there is from last fall and shows sort of the relative frequency of our testing across the state by county. And you can see that center part of New York, 189 samples in Herkimer County. That represents the intensive sampling that we did there in response to that outbreak on a captive facility there in southern Herkimer County. Other areas of intense testing tend to fall along the border of Pennsylvania, which shouldn't be a surprise because chronic wasting disease is scattered throughout Pennsylvania in various locations and at quite high prevalence levels in some of those areas. And so it's a greater risk area for us. Next slide, please. So we have this question, where do you look for CWD? And obviously, if we have sick deer in the state, that's a primary target for us to look at. And so every year we get reports from the public of animals that look emaciated or are acting erratically, maybe they're drooping their heads, showing some of the symptoms that Kevin mentioned earlier that are evidence of late stage CWD. But they're also evidence of a lot of other types of illnesses that deer may have. And so it could be that the deer has a tooth abscess and is not able to feed properly, or it has pneumonia and it's acting erratically, or maybe it has a brain abscess and it's got a cognitive disorder that's not allowing it to feed or walk in circles. Lots of other reasons why deer act weird and become emaciated. Fortunately, we have never found a chronic wasting disease case in New York from an emaciated deer, and we still believe that we have no CWD present in the wild herd. But every time that we find these deer that are suspicious, we're going to test them for CWD. But those are relatively rare on the whole, and we're certainly not testing 2,000 or 3,000 deer this way. And so we have to use a more appropriate method for testing more broadly. Next slide, please. So this is where the strategic surveillance comes into play. we want to sample the areas of highest risk. And one of those factors affecting the risk, of course, is the deer density. CWD, as a communicable disease amongst deer, can spread by nose-to-nose contact and the fluid contact, as was described. And in areas where you have high-density deer populations, you have a lot more contacts and a lot more risk. And so one of the factors that goes into our strategic sampling is simply the presence of deer on the landscape and the relative abundance of deer. And so this map shows our buck harvest density from last fall as an indicator or an index of relative abundance of deer. And you can see portions of the northern zone, the Adirondack area have colored in yellow, relatively low deer densities, whereas the Finger Lakes and portions of western New York, much higher deer densities, and so they represent greater risks. Next slide, please. Now, I mentioned Pennsylvania having chronic wasting disease, and so the presence of CWD in a neighboring state also represents some risk. And not just the presence of CWD, but how well those states are doing their own surveillance. Whether the disease may be present and they don't know because they're not looking as effectively. And so there is some risk of CWD moving across the border just from general animal movement. And that's why we have that area in black all along the Pennsylvania border. But we also have some risk factor along the border with New Jersey and Vermont, Massachusetts, simply because the level of investigation and surveillance that they've been doing has been a bit subpar. And so that represents some risk as well. Next slide. Yet there are other clear risk factors, and captive cervid facilities are one. And so when we first developed the CWD surveillance plan back after our initial detection of CWD, captive cervid facilities were a primary risk factor. At that point, animals were still allowed to move interstate into New York from other jurisdictions. There were some rules put in place that prohibited movement from jurisdictions that had CWD, but there was a lot of movement across the country of captive cervids. And so they represented a real risk for us of having a live deer imported into the state that could potentially bring prion disease agents into the state. And still there's risk. This has changed over time though. And so while we would have put captive cervid facilities as a really high risk factor a decade ago, or maybe even 2 decades ago, in 2013, New York State Department of Agriculture and Markets that oversees these facilities passed a regulation that prohibits the importation of live cervids into New York. And that's probably one of the strongest prevention measures that's been taken to date. And so with that, by removing the potential for importation of live cervids into the state, we reduce some of the risk factors. And so these facilities still represent a risk. We have deer that are confined and could potentially catch CWD through a variety of means, as Kevin laid out. And in fact, just the fact that we had detection this past year on that red deer farm in Herkimer County demonstrates that these cervid facilities, even those that are well run and have well-maintained fences and haven't brought live deer in, still have some risk associated with them. And so it's an important factor in our risk-weighted surveillance system. Next slide, please. And finally, we also include information about the distribution of taxidermists and processors. There's a lot of deer that move through these facilities, and so each of these facilities has some risk associated with it. In terms of taxidermists, it could be the potential importation of a cervid deer or elk head that came in from a western state or somewhere with CWD and is getting processed for a mount. Now that movement would be illegal. The importation of an entire carcass is banned in New York. So hunters cannot bring deer in from Pennsylvania or Colorado or Illinois or Iowa or Vermont for that matter. They cannot bring those whole carcasses into the state. They have to take preventative measures and only bring back the meat and a clean skull cap and clean skull or antlers, but not the entire carcass. And so there is potential for hunters from out of state to bring parts back for taxidermy purposes, but they need to do a lot of preparatory work to remove any of the high risk prion parts before doing so. Nonetheless, just about every year, we have to confiscate animals that come into the state illegally. And so when hunters make those mistakes, either intentionally or unawares, they do put our state at risk. And so taxidermists and their locations are a risk factor, and processors too. As I said, it's illegal to bring the carcass back from another place and bring them into New York, but these processors handle a lot of animals, and every once in a while, a hunter breaks the rules and brings in an illegal deer from somewhere else and potentially brings prions with it. And so we will confiscate and destroy those animals. But depending on how these taxidermists and processors handle their waste, that risk can be present in the environment. They may not dispose of their waste in landfills as expected, but some may dispose of the waste on the landscape, and that could introduce prions to the landscape. So these are risk factor areas as well. And so what we do, next slide please then, is we incorporate all these data into a model that helps us determine the sample quota and where to focus our sampling intensity across the state. And so we have these variety of internal hazards of the survey facilities and taxidermists and processors, and you can see that they're not evenly distributed across the state, that there's some areas that have greater proportions of these facilities in those counties. We also have the risk factors associated with other states, and they represent different levels of risk. And so that center button there, risk assessment survey, we've worked with our staff and other professionals to assess the relative risk with each of these different factors. That then goes into to represent the anthropogenic or sort of human-related risk factors. And then we have the demographic risk, which is the density issue of what is the deer density by county across the state, goes into determining what our final sample quotas. And so we're not just sampling deer kind of helter-skelter randomly as we encounter them across the state doing our normal work with deer in the fall, but we're specifically targeting areas of the state where the risk factors are greatest. And that gives us the most efficiency in collecting the samples and the most confidence that if CWD is present in New York, we're going to find it. Next slide, please. One of the big improvements that we've made to this process in recent years is actually working directly with the taxidermists. And so we've trained taxidermists, and here's Kevin in a thumbnail image of a video that we put together demonstrating how to pull the samples. This video is available on our website. If anyone's interested, they can watch that as well. But it walks through the process of pulling the retropharyngeal lymph nodes out of the head of a deer. And so as we indicated, we pay taxidermists to do this and provide samples for us. And last year, they provided almost 1,000 samples. So that represents almost, not quite a third, or maybe a little bit over a third of our samples from last year. And I believe that is my last slide, and we're going to go on to the next part, which is prevention.
Okay. Well, big thanks to Kevin and Andy and Jeremy, because they've stolen most of my thunder with what they've provided at this point. Although they'd probably argue I've never had any thunder. But I'm going to talk about prevention and how we avoid having CWD in the state and the establishment of it. So I want to just start off with just sort of a really broad perspective on that. There are really only about 5 possible routes of entry and establishment of CWD in the state. One of those is live deer coming in, and I'm not going to talk a lot about that, but I will mention here briefly in a second our interagency prevention plan. The other is the movement of carcasses, and that's been sort of alluded to by some of the folks who've spoken earlier. Coming in from other places with infectious material on them. Biofluids or other contaminated materials, and biofluids, you can read that as urine, if you will, coming into the state, bringing it in. And as Jeremy just sort of suggested with our border with Pennsylvania, having a deer walk in, they're not that far away at this point. Probably far enough away that it's not likely today, but at some point, a deer could simply walk in and bring it into the state. And the last one, and probably not really a risk factor at all, is spontaneous generation. I think there are only 2 or 3 cases of that documented in Europe in very old deer. And think about, I think Kevin mentioned the human prion disease, Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease. That occurs in about 1 in a million human beings on average, but it does occur. We don't expect that. So really what I want to focus on is some take-home messages for the hunters. So next slide, please. So I'm going to focus on really 5 main points. These are the take-homes tonight. These are largely for the hunters in the audience. I'm going to just kind of read these, and then I'll do a slide on each. If you hunt out of state, follow the regulations that we have for CWD. Debone your venison. Don't bring the infectious parts in. As Jeremy mentioned, if we do catch you, you're going to lose the deer. Even if it's the buck of a lifetime, that includes the antlers. It's all going to go away, and it's all going to be destroyed. So adhere to that. And it's not because we want to make your life difficult. It's because we really are very concerned about the implications of CWD on our deer herd for everyone that enjoys deer, and in particular, our hunting heritage going forward. I'll also talk a little bit about avoiding urine-based lures and scents. There are other alternatives that you can use. The risk there may be fairly low, but it's not now. One of the other things, and again, maybe low risk in a state like New York, where it's likely that we don't have CWD, but dispose of your carcass parts appropriately, either where the deer was harvested, if you choose to bone it out in the field or whatever, or process it on your own property, or put it in the waste stream in a landfill, and hunt only wild deer, and I'll get into that in a minute, and don't feed deer. So next slide, please. So some of you, if you hunt out of state, particularly along the Pennsylvania border, may have seen these signs in the last couple of years. They'll be up again this year. We buy them each year, just reminding hunters that leave the state to go to other states that we do have some rules related to CWD management. You can't bring those infectious parts back. So debone the meat before you come back. Antlers, if you're going to mount the animal with a clean skull cap, is absolutely fine. And this is a little dated. I think it's 2020 information, but about 15% of our hunters do go out of state to hunt deer, and that's a big concern for us, because if you're going to places like Pennsylvania where CWD is established, there is a possibility you could bring it back. So do what we need to do. We're all in this together as hunters. DEC cannot prevent CWD on our own by regulation. We have to be conservationists, and we have to work together and take this seriously. Next slide, please. Okay, with respect to natural urine and other lures that are out there, the risk is admittedly fairly low, but prions can be contained in urine, saliva, feces. We don't always know when companies collect these products what exactly is in them, in terms of what it's probably not just urine. There's probably other fluids in there. It's possible, particularly from other states, that infected herds could have infection in them, and it could be transferred to New York. And when you dump that on the ground, you are, as we've heard earlier, prions may remain infectious for up to 16 years. These things could be there for a long, long time. And of course, when you put urine out and other scents, you're attracting deer to it for them to lick and to entice them to look at those products. So our advice is avoid them. Many other states, or I should say several other states, have now banned urine. Some have used voluntary processes for ensuring urine is better, but they're not perfect. We don't know how that urine gets into New York State, and whether or not it could even be recalled if we were to become aware that something was tainted. So the advice here is choose the safe path. If you use lures, I don't. I've never seen any value in them myself personally, but if you do and you've had some success, try those synthetic lures that many of those big manufacturers are producing now. They'll tell you that they think they're probably just as good. Next slide, please. And again, if you're harvesting your deer in New York, where we think the risk is quite low, probably not a big deal, but there's always a risk there. So infected high-risk parts, the bones, the lymph nodes, the stuff you discard, if a deer is infected, could remain on the landscape and become available to the healthy deer that are out there. So if you do process your own deer, I think most of our meat cutters now are putting their discard into the waste stream. That's great news. But if you do handle your own deer, if you want to discard them on the property that you took them on, maybe not a big deal. Otherwise, it's not that hard to double, triple bag, as Kevin mentioned earlier, and put that into the waste stream and get that into a landfill where those things are inaccessible to our wild deer out there. Again, maybe low risk, but again, we're looking at trying to get to zero. Next slide, please. And this gets back to the captive arena a little bit. I don't want to talk too much about it, but captive cervids in high fence operations do add some additional risk factors. Andy talked a bit about the Herkimer circumstance last year. That farm was incredibly well managed. It was not a hunting facility. They were doing virtually everything right as far as we can determine. And yet CWD still ended up there. And we honestly don't know how that happened. What we do know is that herd was a high density herd. And once CWD enters the herd, it's very easy for the disease to spread to those other animals because of that high density. So because of that unusual concentration that just simply occurs when you have deer under a fence. So hunt wild deer. One of the things I like to say is I trust our folks in New York, but there, for whatever motivations people have, there are folks that are willing to pay big bucks for big bucks. And that does, much like the drug trade and everything else, provide some incentive for some illegal movement of live animals that, as Jeremy mentioned, has been banned since 2013 in this state. So, go fair chase, hunt wild deer, maybe avoid that if you can, and maybe we're all better off for it. Next slide, please. And I think this is the last of the 5 points that I want to make is don't feed deer. Feed itself, because mammalian proteins added to feed were banned, 3 decades ago. The stuff that might contain prions. But even though the risk of the feed itself containing contaminated materials may be low, you are concentrating animals. And when they're together, as you see in this photo, they're licking, they're peeing, they're pooping. All of those materials that could contain prions are potentially there. And to be honest, when you concentrate animals in these kinds of densities, if one is sick, obviously the risk of some transmission escalates. And that's a real concern because, as was mentioned earlier, CWD takes quite a while to manifest in deer. So one sick deer infecting some others may actually take a year or two before we'd even be able, under the best case scenario, be able to detect disease in the wild. And at that point, we've probably lost the battle. It's out there, and infection is starting to go somewhat rampant. So don't feed them. That's the bottom line. That's one of the take homes. And last slide, I think. So we have created a number of different videos over the last 2 or 3 years speaking to issues related to CWD. I'd encourage anyone that's on tonight to tune into them. A little more information in some cases than what we even provided tonight. And I'd hope you partake of that and share that with your neighbors that might not have been on tonight. A final comment, maybe to wrap up, if there's not more after this. We want you all out there to enjoy the deer herd as it is. We want our deer herd to be healthy and very vibrant and available for all to enjoy. If you're a hunter, we want you to know that the meat you're harvesting is good and safe, and as you would expect it to be, and as you deserve it to be. And we would hope that continues not only for this generation, but for the next generation and for many, many to follow. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Jim, and thank you to all the panelists tonight that presented for us. We do have a bit of time for any questions that folks may have. I'm going to advance back. Sorry for the walkthrough, but I'm going to advance forward to this slide for folks to have more information on CWD. If you're interested in learning more, you can go to our website, and all the information we've gone over tonight will be there. Like I said, though, if anybody has any final questions, we had a few great questions come in throughout the webinar tonight. But if you have any final questions, we will hang on for a few more minutes. But other than that, I think we thank you for attending tonight and listening. But we will give it a moment here as our questions come in. No questions yet, but a couple thank yous, and we appreciate the thank yous and appreciate you guys, your time being here tonight as well. So like I said, we'll give it a couple more minutes. Jeremy, Jim, Andy, Kevin, if you have any final thoughts, you can feel free to drop them in, chime in now. But other than that, we'll just hang out, wait another minute or two, and call it a night. Okay, I'm not seeing any questions, but I am seeing a bunch of thank yous. So I think people are getting questions in. Kevin adds any sick acting deer that we become aware of in any areas. So again, if you do have any questions, I'm going to put it in the chat one more time. Any questions that we didn't answer tonight, please go ahead and send us an email at wildlife.ny.gov. I'm happy to answer any questions that we didn't get to or that you weren't able to ask tonight. So with that, I think we'll go ahead and close it. Again, thank you everybody for attending tonight, and thank you to our presenters. Have a good night.